So this is the Bible kind of broken into chunks based on like how the scholars see it, okay? And I gave you guys, every table has a handout, and I gave you guys a pen. And unfortunately, I don't have hundreds of highlighters, or I would have given y'all highlighters so that y'all could color code it, because I actually think color coding it helps some. Now, when I originally did this class, I was like, I'm going to do all 66 books in 1 week, which is possible, and I was writing that way. But then I also know there's a reality of, sorry, I'm getting in the way if y'all want to take pictures. There's a reality of like the human mind can only retain so much information in a 1 hour window. And so what I don't want to happen is me to get through all of these books of the Bible and then you guys walk. Sometimes I ask my kids after I'm done teaching, I'm like, what did you guys get from this? Like, I don't know, you said something about Moses or something like that. I don't know. And so that's what I don't want to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this class going, and I'm going to actually let this class evolve into an 8-week class, but I'm going to do a break in between. So what I'm going to try to do with these 4 weeks is I'm going to try to do the whole Old Testament with you guys. And then I'm going to come back and do another 4 weeks in probably October and do the other 4. And so I split it into weeks. So tonight we're going to do law, and we're going to talk about the setup, the beginning, Genesis all the way down to Moses. And then next week we'll pick up and we'll do history. And so this is kind of how the sections are broke out. And like I said, I gave you guys an Old Testament thing on your table. If you want to fill it out now, you can. I actually think it's good if you handwrite it. Sometimes it helps you commit it to memory, and it helps you get a better mental picture of what's happening in each book. And that's my goal tonight. I don't want to overload you guys with too much data because there's so much here. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to skim all the books and find what I like to call the thread, which is God working through all of these people's lives. And the whole time that you read all these stories, you can really see where all of this leads to. And I'll come back to this, okay, for all my straight A students out there. He's doing a great job. I'll come back. This timeline is kind of where I want to start because I want to show you guys. I made this timeline and kind of broke it into the things that were happening at that time roughly. And I know it's kind of hard to read from far away, but let me give you an idea. And the reason I want to show you this timeline is because I want to say everything I'm about to read to you guys and tell you what this book represents, all of it leads to Jesus. And so it's weird maybe at first, but the more you learn about the Bible, the more you realize that the whole thing is actually about him. And all the roads and all these different paths these people take are leading us to this conclusion, that we need a Savior, that mankind needs to be saved, us included. And so that should be the thread that's being weaved to this whole thing, starting with Adam and Eve. And that's where I'm going to start tonight. So book number 1 on the list is Genesis. You guys know that. Everybody's very familiar, or at least somewhat familiar with Genesis. Now this timeline, I have a zoomed in version. This is all the way from 0 to 4,500-ish. Nobody really knows exactly when the story of Adam and Eve takes place. They just know it's 4,500 plus. Nobody knows the exact date, okay? So from creation to Babel is basically chapters 1 through 11. So you guys kind of know how the story goes. God creates from disorder and darkness. God brings out of it beauty and order. Okay, the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. I like to relate back to that and go, that is the Holy Spirit. So when we say things like the Holy Spirit, it's the same, it's like the energy of God. If you could picture the energy of God hovering over the face of the waters, shaping the earth. God creates the earth in 7 days of work and rest. He creates humans made in his holy image. They were made to be reflections of God's character, to rule the world of order that he created. So he gave Adam and Eve a garden. Everybody pretty much has heard of the Garden of Eden, right? God puts a tree there. There's actually 2 trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And most people know this story, but I like to take this approach and say, symbolically, think of the garden symbolically and think, one tree says, I trust God, and I'm going to eat of the tree of life because I trust that he's my provider and that he's got me. And the other tree says, I'm not so sure God's got it. I think I need to step in and figure it out for myself. Okay, and that's the sinful nature that's in everybody that says autonomy and being self-made is what I am. God didn't have anything to do. I'm self-made. Don't y'all, it's pride, right? And so this tree is symbolic for like Adam and Eve chose autonomy. And Lucifer convinced them that they'd be better off if they were in the driver's seat. And God is actually can't be trusted. And everybody looks at the story and they're like, I can't believe they were that stupid. Why would they listen to a snake? Like, why didn't Eve just resist the snake? It's like, you'd be surprised how many of you guys eat of this tree every day. And you'd be like, what? Every day we get two trees presented to us. Metaphorically speaking, we have two trees, and we get to decide every day. And so when Paul says, like, pick up your cross daily and choose to follow me, it is symbolically the same exact idea. We're presented with, are you going to trust God today when you go out and live your day and believe that he is your provider and that everything comes from him and everything is for him? Or do you want to choose the tree of autonomy, where you get to decide everything? And you're God, but here's the other side of it. If we get to choose, do we trust God's way or ours? Do we believe that God has us? Or do we feel like he doesn't got it and we need to intervene? So Adam and Eve chose their way, and this is what happens. They were immediately aware that they were vulnerable. So with self-made autonomy also comes fear and shame of knowing that you're vulnerable to all sorts of things. And that's when anxiety, fear, jealousy, insecurity, that's when they set in. So it's like that autonomy comes at a cost. And the cost is you now have to carry it. And so in Scripture, Jesus says, if you will take on my yoke is light and easy. So if you'll eat of this tree where you trust me as your provider, it will be an easy, light life for you. You'll be full of peace and love everywhere that you go. But if you choose to eat of the tree of autonomy, where you're self-made and it's all you, it's going to be heavy. And so one of the first things that happens with Adam and Eve after they eat of this tree is they're immediately aware that they're naked, and their trust for each other is broken. And they're immediately at odds with each other. And they're at odds with God. So the consequence first was that their connection with God was severed. It used to be solid in the garden. There was trust and provision, and they decided to become self-made and self-autonomous, and they broke that connection with God. But the very next step is that they broke it with each other. Naked and afraid, suddenly have no trust, even for each other. The intimacy was broken, first between God, then each other. God issues 3 curses here. And you're like, wow, God's really mean. This is actually grace. Already on day 1, God is extending grace for their failure because the consequence of eating that tree was death. So they should have both dropped dead when they ate it. So God even giving them a curse, even though that sounds strange, is actually grace. So to Adam, he says, you're going to work hard and you're subject to seasons and pain. And I have this old school painting of them being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and they're real tiny over here. And what you're looking at is like beauty and order. Everything's provided. And they're being kicked out into what is called the cursed world that we live in now, subject to hurricanes, volcanoes, famines. Why does that stuff happen? We live in the curse. We live in a cursed and fallen world that chose autonomy. And with that autonomy comes a lot of weight and a lot of uncertainty. Okay, so Adam's was, you're going to have to work hard and sweat the rest of your life. You're going to have to grind it out, bro. You're going to be grinding the rest of your life. So Eve's was pain in childbirth and enmity towards Adam. And that's a deep one I could unpack, but I'll breeze over it and just say, God is going, Adam's going to have authority over you, and it's going to annoy you the rest of your life, but that's just how it's going to be. And so you're going to want the authority that God extends to him, but you're not going to be able to get it. So you're going to be stuck in this loop of being frustrated. To the snake, he turns to the snake and curses the snake, and he says, despite his apparent victory, there will come another. There's 2 parts to this curse. The first part is interesting. He says, I curse the snake, and you're going to crawl in the belly the rest of your life, and of the dust of the earth you'll eat. Now, there's a cool type and shadow here of Satan only being able to, Adam was made from what? The dust of the earth, right? So the devil can only get at your dust. He can't actually get at your spirit, but he can get at your flesh. He can only eat of the dust of the earth. Does that make sense? So I don't know what he looked like before, if that was metaphorical. I don't know if he crawled around with arms and legs. I don't know. But either way, the curse is that he's going to crawl on his belly the rest of his life, and of the dust of the earth is what he's going to eat. And then the second part of the curse is that one would come and crush his head. And if y'all were here on Easter, I gave this sermon about the snake crusher, and this is the very first prophecy of Jesus. So remember when I told you guys earlier, like this entire book, starting from the very beginning, is about Jesus. And there's a side to understanding the Bible that there's all kinds of stuff in the Bible that you can prove and you can back it up with this, but there's also a side of the Bible where you need to just like have faith. And it's called the mystery. And Paul even says like, it's a mystery. I just have faith and I believe in it. And I'll talk more about that, but here's the promise of the one to come. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman. He's talking to the snake here, and he says, between your seed and her seed. He will bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So what's that talking about? He's saying, like, he's going to defeat death, but in the process, he's going to be bitten and have to die for it. So he's talking about Jesus on the cross, right? He's talking about, like, he's going to conquer and defeat death forever, but it's going to cost him his life in the process. So they're cast out of the garden. They're cursed, dragged back into darkness and disorder, separated from God, and pushed them into the fallen world we live in now, subject to disaster, starvation, pain, and death. So some time goes by. They have sons, Cain and Abel. I don't have any cool photos for this. Y'all just have to use your imagination. Jealous of his brother's favor with God, Cain murders Abel and then hides from God. So Cain's fully aware of God. Abel has a sacrifice that God honors, and he doesn't honor Cain's. You could do an entire sermon on why that is, but I'm going to go quickly here. Either way, he kills his brother and he hides. And I never thought, you always read scripture sometimes and think Cain was just this bad guy only. Like, no, God spoke to Cain too. And he comes to Cain and he goes, hey, where's your brother at? His blood calls out to me from the earth. In other words, like, I know what you did. What happened to your brother? And Cain says the famous line, what am I, my brother's keeper? You ever heard that one? And God says, I know what you did. Why did you do that? And Cain is like, I'm full of fear. I'm scared to go around anybody because if they find out what I did, they'll kill me. And so God actually, it says that he marks Cain somehow. This is the first tattoo in the Bible, maybe. And he says, if anybody touches you, I will avenge you sevenfold. So he basically kind of curse blesses him, sort of, and says, if anybody, you're my boy, and if anybody messes with you, they'll get it, is basically what he's saying. So there's a lot of obscurity here in the text where we don't have a lot of data. Like I said, we hear conceptually about the garden, but nobody knows exactly where it's at. And it describes the location in the scriptures, but a lot of the descriptions of the places don't exist anymore. So you can go online and see all sorts of speculations of where people feel like it was at. I feel like it's possible. Anyway, I could go rabbit trail for it. Let me not go there. I could do a whole class on Genesis. Let me just say that. I could go for days. Okay, so Cain and Abel here. A little bit of time goes by. Lamech is one of Cain's descendants. So we're talking 5-6 generations deep. Lamech is very wicked. He brags about how wicked he is. And the earth gets eviler and eviler, basically. And I know that sounds strange, but that's just kind of how it goes. Ever since they left the garden and they chose autonomy, sin began to run rampant in their life. And they just kept going further and further down this pit to where it got so bad that Lamech says, you know about my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Cain? You know, and he's talking to a huge city of people because at this time they had already built up a city. So massive city, lots of violence, lots of everything wicked you could think of. And he's bragging to everyone and says, God says it's 7 times the vengeance. Well, for Lamech, it's 77 times the vengeance. Like, I'm 77 times more violent and evil than he was. So he's bragging about how wicked he is. And I'm trying to paint this picture because the earth at that time was in disarray. And so God comes to a man, let's see if it'll turn, a man named Noah. And so God looks at all the earth and he says, I'm actually sad at how wicked this has gotten. And it says God is full of grief. He's grieved by how much evil has set in over this course of time. But Noah. And again, this is another one of those stories where there's not a whole lot of data there. I can tell you exactly what the book says, but it's one of those you got to trust the mystery kind of thing. Why did he choose the flood? Why did it go that? I don't know. And I've heard it said like this, and I love this saying. It says, we've always used science to try to prove the Bible, and it should be the other way around. The Bible actually tells us what happened, so we use science to learn how. Does that make sense? And we still are actively learning new things about science all the time, right? So it would be arrogant to even say we know how it works, because not even 400 years ago, we thought the earth was flat. And then another 400 years before that, we thought we were the only planet in the solar system. And then another 400 years before that, we thought the sun and the moon were gods that were fighting every day, and they would rise if we... Y'all see what I'm getting at here? We still, even as a society, are moving forward in science and technology. And it's like the further we get down science and technology, the more we learn about what we're made of as humans. We start to learn about how our emotions matter, our spiritual condition matters. And it almost begins to, as we move forward, science begins to make more sense out of what happened. And so it's good to view the Bible that way, like I said. It's mysterious, and there's a lot of uncertainties, but yes, we'll view it that way. I got to keep them. We got a lot of traction to make here. So, city gets evil. God tells Noah, I'm going to flood the earth. He has the animals. Most of you guys know the story. Him and the boys build this huge ark. They load up animals 2 by 2. Somebody made a life-size replica of the ark. It's pretty cool. You can go visit it. It's massive boat. Okay, so God floods the earth, and he chooses. It says there's some more strange stuff. Okay, it says the sons of God were mating with women. That's really strange. What the heck does that mean? Fallen angels fell down to the earth, kicked out of heaven, mated with regular women of men during this period of wickedness. And it says there were giants in the land, and they're called Nephilim. And so there's a whole theory that people used to be huge back then, pre-flood. Because before the flood, the ozone layer was thicker, and so the oxygen to carbon ratio was different. So everybody could breathe more oxygen, and their bodies were bigger. It's possible that everybody back then was 12, 13, 14 foot tall. So the idea of building a boat this size wouldn't be that strange. It's strange to us. Like, you'd have to have cranes and all that. What I'm getting at is, like, nobody knows, right? These are all just speculations. What if that was the case? And then after the flood, the ozone layer thickness shrivels down to what we're used to now. And now our bodies can only grow to 6, 7 foot before they begin malfunctioning, right? If you grow to 13 feet, usually you don't live very long because you don't have enough oxygen to carbon to be able to, like, sustain your muscle tissue. Anyway, I'll rabbit trail forever about Dennis sometime. So what's the moral of the story? The earth got so wicked, God was grieved. He worked through Noah and spared. And Noah, the very first thing he does when he gets out of the boat is he makes a sacrifice to God. And this is where the rainbow is the promise. The rainbow represents the promise that God made that he would never flood the earth again. And I've joked before, whenever Harvey hit, I was like, God, you said. So there's even a spot in Turkey. It says the boat landed in the mountains of Ararat, mountains with a plural, so it could have been any of the mountains in that region. And they feel like archaeologists has found the remnants of this boat. I don't know if that's true or not. It sounds cool, though. Okay, moral of the story is he lands, okay, and this is like the general region approximately where the boat lands. And from Noah's sons, he has Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And they spread out and have kids. And documented in the Bible, it says that Noah has 16 grandsons. And so you think, like, there's more to it. Okay, so it looks sort of like this. The grandsons that you see listed in the Bible are actually nations that they're describing. And so when you hear the name, these are the descendants of Ham, okay, which would be like the North African tribes. The red would be Shem. Shem is the linguistic word that is where we got the word Semitic. Y'all have heard of the Semitic language? Comes from Shem and his bloodline. And then this would be Japheth up here. This would be like the Macedonians and the Greeks and basically all of Europe. And so the Bible scholars at that time were writing how these weren't just kids that were Noah's grandsons. These are actually nations they're describing, full of people. Now, let me zoom in a little bit. The story goes a little further in Genesis, and it takes us to this story. And the earth began on the same path it was on before the flood. Men started coming together and almost in an act of defiance, build a tower to prove how strong their autonomy was and how eating of the tree of autonomy was the right move. In fact, they wanted to almost show God as an act of rebellion how powerful their choice was, that they were equal to or greater than God. And so they began building a tower up to the heavens. And God sees this, fearing he'd have to flood the earth again. He scatters them, is what it says. And so he scatters them all throughout the earth, and he says that he mixes up their language, and so they can't speak to each other. And so, again, the Tower of Babel story is only about a chapter long. There's not a lot of detail there. It's just one of those things where we know what happened. We're not exactly sure how. And we're not exactly sure all the details. We just know what happened. Okay. Now, one second. So, Tower of Babel, a symbolic image of human rebellion and arrogance. The same garden rebellion, but on a larger scale. Instead of cleansing the earth again, God changes strategies, and the story gets a little more focused into a man and a covenant. And this new idea of forming a holy nation of people that would be set apart. Unlike what was happening on earth, maybe this new people could honor the Lord, and maybe, just maybe, even host his holy energy, his presence. So, now, we're going chapters 12 through 50. This is where we jump ahead a little bit. One of those descendants, right over here, he was a Chaldean, guy named Terah, has 3 kids. One of those 3 kids is Abraham. Abraham's brother dies. The dad moves them up here to Haran. And it's in Haran that God comes down to Abraham for the very first time. And he says, leave your home, leave your father's house, take all your belongings. I want you to move into the land of Canaan. I'm going to give you that land, and I'm going to start a new nation through you. So he does it. He obeys God. Him and his nephew Lot pack up their stuff, and they move down to Canaan. And it's there that Abraham gets this vision of God saying, you see this land in front of you? I'm going to give this to you and your people. And through you, I'm going to build a holy nation that's going to go far beyond your family. It's going to be as multitude as the sand. You can't even count it, how many descendants you have. And so if you are a Christian, and you are one of Abraham's sons, basically is the gist. You're either his son or his daughter. You are a descendant of Abraham and the holy family of God. So Abraham is literally the forefather. Now, this is the land of Canaan, just so you guys know, that region of that time. It's not necessarily a city, it's just that whole space. This is Father Abraham here. Abraham has a son named Isaac. Isaac is the very first type and shadow of Jesus. They're almost described the exact same way. And this is a crazy test that he puts Abraham's faith through. Why does he do that? I don't know. I'm not the Lord. But he does. And he asked him to sacrifice his firstborn son. And I know people are like, sacrifice is incredibly brutal and crazy. It is, but not back then. Sacrifice was incredibly common, and people did it all the time. And so people were very used to worshiping gods back then. There was just hundreds of gods. And so it wasn't a big deal to make sacrifices. So he obeys God, and an angel shows up with a ram. And there's a cool story of every time we wonder whether or not we should trust God, and we're coming up one side of the mountain believing him, God is sending the provision up at the exact same time. Anyway. Okay, so Isaac has a son named Jacob. Now Jacob is the same Jacob that does Jacob's ladder. Jacob is a deceiver. He steals the birthright from his brother, who should have been his brother's. And fearing that his brother would kill him because he stole his birthright, his mom goes, why don't you go live with your uncle for a while so your brother doesn't cut your head off when you're not looking? So Jacob leaves, and on his way to his uncle's house, he has an encounter with the Lord, and God opens up heaven and shows him angels coming up and down. And this is where Jacob's ladder comes from. And God makes a new covenant with him. He's like, you know how I made a covenant with Abraham? I'm making another one with you. That promise that I made to Abraham is still true, and it's going to come through your family bloodline. So don't give up. So Jacob goes and works for his uncle for several years. His uncle deceives him. The player gets played. So Jacob, the hustler, gets out-hustled by his uncle, and his uncle tricks him into marrying his oldest daughter first, and then his younger daughter, Rachel. Jacob then is asked by God. God's like, all right, you've been out here serving long enough. It's time for you to go back home and be with the rest of your family. Gather all your belongings. And God had really been blessing Jacob where he was at his uncle's farm. So he had lots of people, lots of stuff. He was very wealthy. So Jacob begins moving all his stuff across. And he comes to this thing. He's very nervous that his brother's going to kill him. And so he sends all of his caravan of stuff into the land where his brother lives, and he goes, hey, tell my brother Esau that he can have whatever he wants in any of the caravans, and I'm just going to be back in the cut. Let me know when he's ready for me to walk across. So Jacob stays back on this side of the river, and he sends all of his belongings, all of his wives, all of his kids, everything. And it's in this moment that Jacob, life is going to change forever, and this is where Jacob dies and Israel is born. And God comes down that night and wrestles with Jacob. And Jacob says, I cannot cross this river until you bless me. He's terrified because he knows if God doesn't go with him, his brother is going to kill him, right? And so the angel's wrestling with him, it says, all night till the sun came up. And he says, let go of me. And he's like, no, I'm not letting go till you bless me. You have to be on my life. I can't go any farther. And so the angel touches his hip, and he renames him Israel. So this is where the name Israel starts, right here. And he says that through you, I'm going to create this nation. Okay, so Jacob is renamed to Israel, which means to struggle with God. If you are curious about that. So Israel goes on to form this massive nation of people, and these are the 12 sons of Jacob. And I'm going to speed run through this, but his most famous son is a kid named Joseph. And Joseph has a God-given talent and ability to predict dreams. God gives him this talent. And since Joseph is the firstborn of Rachel, which is the wife that Jacob wanted, right? Remember there's the older sister and the younger sister? This is the firstborn of her kids. And so the dad loves him more than the other kids, which is kind of messed up, but he does. And he makes him a custom coat with multiple colors and celebrates his birth. And his other brothers get jealous, and they don't like that. And so they trick him and sell him into slavery. And Joseph finds himself in Egypt. So he goes from this city of Shechem where they lived all the way over here to Egypt. And he finds himself at this dude's house named Potiphar. And Potiphar was essentially like the general for Pharaoh who kept the prisoners at his house. So he had a jail cell at his house. And he serves this dude well. And this next rest of the story, Joseph ends up getting chiseled and handsome and tan from working so much. All that manual labor is paying off. And so his wife, Potiphar's wife, sees Joseph and makes a pass at him because she says, wow, that dude's handsome. I'm going to make a move. And Potiphar finds out about this and locks Joseph up. And Joseph spends the next 2 years in silence in prison. Nobody talking to him. And he meets these two guys there, a butcher and a baker, and they both work for Pharaoh. And Joseph predicts both of their dreams. He uses that God-given talent that God gave him to predict their dreams. And he says, make sure before you boys leave, they're both going to get out. And he says, before y'all leave, make sure you tell Pharaoh about me and what I can do so I don't get left in this stupid jail cell any longer. Anyway, another 2 years go by. Nobody says a word to Joseph. He could have easily given up hope right there, but he stays true to God the whole time. And the day comes that Pharaoh has a nightmare. The Pharaoh of Egypt has a nightmare that the whole thing, there's these dead cows, and they come out of the water, and they're going to eat everything up. So he panics, and he hears about this Hebrew kid that they have in jail somewhere that knows how to read dreams. And so he goes, go get that little Hebrew kid. They take Joseph. They wash him up. I have sort of and they turn him into like a full-on Egyptian-looking dude. And he goes before Pharaoh and he says, I always thought this is interesting. He doesn't, Pharaoh tells him the dream, and then Joseph says, God's actually the one that gave you that dream. And he says, Yahweh, like the God of Israel, is the one that gave you, Pharaoh, that dream. Which is strange because Pharaoh does not regard the God of Israel whatsoever. Does that make sense? So God was doing something here, and this is one of those threads that God's working through. You would see a situation like Joseph and think, this dude is getting the worst hand dealt anyone has ever got in their life. But God was actually behind the scenes working the whole time. And so he says, it's cool to me that Joseph had the wisdom to be able to see that it was God was the one that telling Pharaoh about this dream. Anyway, he tells Pharaoh that dream, what's going to happen, it's God telling you that a famine is coming. And it's going to be a 7-year-long famine, and so you need to prepare for it. And the Pharaoh's like, what are you talking about, bro? How does that even work? And Joseph's like, well, you get some silos set aside, and you store up grain in every single city. That way when the hits, we can feed everybody. And so Pharaoh's like, okay, great, you should do that. And he puts Joseph second in command of all of Egypt, which is wild. So he goes from a Hebrew slave to being second in command of Pharaoh himself, which essentially was like the king, if you can think of it that way. So Joseph does this. He sets aside grain, and the famine hits, and lots of people starve. They show up in droves, and there's a massive transfer of wealth back to the palace. And Pharaoh, people come from everywhere. They get food, they buy food, and this Pharaoh really likes Joseph. He's like, this is my boy right here. Do whatever he says. He has all my trust. Whatever this guy puts his hand to, he does it with excellence. And it must be that God he serves. That must be a real God, because this dude is legit. And so some time goes by, and I'm paraphrasing now. It's for time. And we're down our timeline now, okay? So here we're back to this timeline real quick. So we did Noah and the flood. Men rebuild a new kingdom. We had the Tower of Babel, okay? And this is where Job's story is, and I'll come back to that later because Job's part of poetry, but I'll come back to that. So Abraham now, Isaac, Jacob, and then we're here at Joseph's story. So provision, okay? So God uses that situation that Joseph's in to save the nation of Israel. So what he ends up doing is he has all this food now, and everybody in the whole land around them is starving. So everybody's basically forced to come to Egypt and buy grain. And Joseph's family shows up. So Jacob and all 12 of his sons, the same brothers that sold him into slavery, right? And they show up and they see Joseph and they don't know it's him, and they begin speaking to each other in Hebrew. And they don't realize that Joseph is Joseph and he speaks Hebrew. So he begins weeping and runs out of the room. And they're like, what is up with that Egyptian dude? Why is he so upset? And they had no idea it's your brother. And he finally reveals himself to them. And he says, I am your brother that you sold into slavery all those years ago. But let me read the line. He says, what you intended for evil, God actually used for good. So even though I want to be resentful at you guys, I'm actually part of God's thread. And so I forgive you, basically. And so now Israel is saved. Jacob and his family have food, and they end up basically moving from Shechem down into Egypt. So now the Hebrew people live in Egypt. So some time goes by, the provision era, and a new Pharaoh is in town, and it says this Pharaoh did not know Joseph. In other words, I don't know what deal the last Pharaoh made with this Joseph dude, but I don't know who this dude is, so deal's off. And he doesn't like that the Hebrews begin multiplying the way that they do, so he orders basically a genocide. And he says the firstborn of every Hebrew should be killed. That way we can control their numbers. There's too many of them. Okay, so this Pharaoh was brutal, and it says that he abused them and was terrible to the Hebrew people, and they would cry out for help to God. And so the scriptures say, now we're Joseph's story is the end of Genesis. I meant to show you guys that, sorry. So we're out of Genesis now. The very last part of Genesis is the story of Joseph, providing for his nation, okay? And the next story picks up in the book of Exodus. So now we're moving on to book 2, which is Exodus. So 400 years have passed. This new Pharaoh does not know Joseph. He decides they're too numerous. And so God raises up a new leader. And I have some, where are we at here? Sorry, I have so many. What do we got? 100 here. Okay, Hebrews, Egypt, slaves, being mistreated. They cry out to God for help, and God decides to send someone their way. And this is where we come to arguably one of the most legendary characters in all of the Bible, and that is Mr. Moses, or Moshua. And this is the city of Avaris. And what happens is his mom is a Hebrew, and she puts him in a basket, sends him down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him and goes, wow, a cute puppy, I want to adopt this for myself. And she brings Moses into her home, okay? And she begins to raise him. So I have sort of a concept of young Moses here, would be basically full-on Egyptian trained and look and all of that. But all the while he's Hebrew, and no one's really telling him that. He just grows up in the palace. Well, one day he's older now, okay? So some years go by. Moses is older. Let's say he's in his 20s at this point, and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And so that leads you to believe that at some point someone tells him that he's Hebrew, okay? So apparently he finds out that he's Hebrew, and now all of a sudden has a heart for these people. And when he sees one of them get mistreated, he actually fires off and goes crazy on one of the slave masters and kills him. And so, fearing for his own life, he runs away to the land of Midian. Okay, so he flees Ramesses, crosses the peninsula, and makes his way over here to the land of Midian. Kind of looks something like that. And he rolls up on this camp of people. There's more to the story. He helps these girls. They're getting water for their camels, and these bandits come up, and Moses defends them. Okay, so then they go, come with us to our tent camp. So Moses comes and rolls up on this camp, and he meets this dude. One of my favorite characters in the whole Bible. This is Jethro. Jethro is the father-in-law, future father-in-law of Moses. Now what's interesting is Jethro is from the Kenite tribe. The Kenites are tent makers who would have been long-lost descendants of Abraham. And so even though it's strange to think about that these people that lived way over here would be tied to Yahweh, but they are. They worship and serve Yahweh, the same God of Abraham. And so Moses finds himself in a godly family, and Jethro is the high priest of Midian, so he's like the head priest. Okay, so another cool story. I've taught a class on Deborah. Have you ever heard of Jael, the chick that drives a spike to the dude's head? She's actually a Kenite. She's a descendant of Jethro. Anyway, that's side nerd stuff. Okay, back to Moses here. Moses marries Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, and becomes a shepherder. And so he's working for Jethro now out in the shepherd fields, and he's completely changed his whole identity. I mean, he used to be like a rich prince with all the gear, and now bros looks like a regular Hebrew shepherd. So he kind of switched gears pretty hard. And one day, he sees a little sparkle off in the distance, and he wonders, I wonder what that is. And I've talked about this on a Sunday before. I always thought it was like an explosion or something, but it was a little thing off to the side, and it actually says that Moses is walking his sheep through the mountains, and out of curiosity, he goes to find out what it is. And I always ask, I wonder how many things in our life are like that we just walk right past. And God's like trying to show us something, but we don't really develop our sight for that. I wonder how many burning bushes we walk right past. Anyway, Moses chooses to leave what he's doing and his responsibilities, and he goes over and checks it out, and this is where we get the scene of the burning bush. And God says, take off your sandals, the ground at which you stand is holy ground. And Moses is like, holy cow, who are you? And he says, I am the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember the patriarchs that we studied earlier. And he says, the same covenant and promise I made with them, I'm going to use you to fulfill that. So Moses is like, how on earth are you going to do that? We're currently in Egypt as slaves. That's not even possible. And God says, I'm going to strike down Pharaoh's arrogance through you using these plagues. And some of you guys may or may not know about the 10 plagues. And so Moses obeys the Lord. Jethro's happy about this, by the way. He's like, Yahweh came and talked to you? Bro, let's go. And he's like, take whatever you want. Take Zipporah, the kids, camels, whatever you want. Y'all go to Egypt immediately. This is like the best day ever. So Moses does it, and he goes and confronts Pharaoh in Egypt. And Pharaoh is not kind. And they go on this series of 10 plagues. And I've done a whole class on Moses if y'all want the extreme details, but it's interesting. Like I said earlier, Spiritual warfare is real. And so I know this sounds strange, but like there was also sorcerers at that time that could do magic and all kinds of stuff. And so God was entering a world that was pretty wicked with a lot of trickery already. And so all of the plagues that he uses against Egypt are almost in direct contrast to the God that they were worshiping for that thing. So it sounds weird, but like they had the frogs as one of the plagues. They actually have a frog god who runs the Nile River that they worship all the time. So God, he was going one at a time, basically discrediting each single one of them, showing them who the actual God was. Anyway, the things end at the very last plague, and this one's hardcore. This is a judgment on all of the Egyptian gods, including Pharaoh himself, and God takes the firstborn kid, and this is where he tells the Hebrew people, go home tonight and take a lamb's blood and wipe it over your door, and it will protect you from the angel of death that's going to pass through the city. And so this is where that tradition's born. Some of you guys know about that. We do Passover here, but if you're in Jewish customs, like it's very hardcore. They eat the whole meal, every single detail. It's very specific. It actually came from that event, is what I'm trying to say. And the reason they set aside time for that is they're looking back to that Passover meal. Okay, so Pharaoh goes, enough is enough. My own son has died. God obviously means business. You're allowed to take the Israelites and leave. And so Moses rounds up roughly 1.5 million people. That's a lot of people. I've showed this before. Like Times Square crams like 900,000 in that little small block. So just imagine trying to organize and move that many people. So here they are going across the desert. God comes down in a flame and a pillar of smoke and guides them through the desert. And they make their way following this pillar. This is how they know where to go. And God takes them basically on this journey to Etham, and they find themselves on this beach. And this is where we get the famous parting of the Red Sea. All I have is like this amalgamation. But Moses, as they're making their way, they get word that Pharaoh decided to go back on his word, and now he wants to chase them. So Pharaoh is like, I can't believe I let them Egyptian people go. And he rounds up the boys and decides to hawk down the Hebrew people. Well, now they're pinned on the beach, and they don't know what to do. And so God comes down in a pillar of fire and blocks the Egyptians and buys the Hebrew people some time. Moses is like, well, I'm glad you did that, but I don't know what to do now. What am I supposed to do? There's a huge ocean behind me. And God's like, why are you complaining to me? Turn around and lift your staff and split the water. So he's like, all right. And he does it. He turns around and says some pretty awesome statements, but he says like, God is with us and he's going to make a way. And so he splits the sea and they cross. And they make their way to the other side of the desert. The waves, Pharaoh and his chariots chase them. The waves crash down and kill all of them. And so the Egyptian people are wiped out. Their military is wiped out. There's still people back home, but the military is wiped out. And the Israelite people are safe on the other side of the land. Now they go on a few journeys here to Mara, to Elam, through the wilderness of Sin, to Rephidim. And Rephidim is where, some of you have heard this before, this is where Moses splits the rock. This is where they believe the rock is still there to this day. The rock's massive. But he hits the rock and water comes out of it. And I put this in my storytelling because this rock is like, and you'll read this later in Colossians. This is another one of those threads. The rock is symbolic of Jesus and how he was going to have to be struck. And from his death, after he gets struck, living water would flow out of it. So that's the rock. They drink from this rock for pretty much the next year, because what they do for the next year is they come to what's called Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai is where God himself's presence comes down and dwells on top of this mountain. And all of Israel shakes at the base. They're like, whoa. We were complaining about food and all that. We had no idea it was going to be this hardcore. They're scared and they don't want to go up. But it says God calls Moses up, and Moses walks in. And God says, keep people away from this mountain. They cannot come in proximity of my presence at the exact same time. They have too much sin in their life, and they'll fall over dead. So part of the reason this cloud is dark is because the glory of God is inside of this cloud. He even tells Aaron he can come up, but he needs to stop before the cloud starts. Because if he even peeks his face in and sees me, he'll die. So Moses was something special to be able to walk into this. And he goes up there, and this is where God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. And this is an illustration someone did, I'm not sure, but he writes it out and gives it to him and gives him the laws. And these are like holy laws and instruction. He talks about all sorts of things, and I'm going to have to speed up a little bit for time, but he gives him the 10 Commandments. And these are idolized everywhere. Like, I mean, you guys have seen like 10 Commandments all over the place, right? And the 10 Commandments are important, but they're not really supposed to be idolized. They're supposed to be representations of like, we can't actually fulfill the law. We need Jesus to do it. And so Jesus is actually the one that goes, I didn't come to say this doesn't matter. I came to fulfill it. He says, I didn't come to abolish the law and pretend like it doesn't matter. It definitely matters. I came to fulfill the law because no other human can fulfill it. We fall short every single time. Even the legendary people like Moses and David and all these legends in the Bible, they also fall short. So, 10 Commandments, he starts giving them instructions. And this is like where basically Exodus 20 through 40 is all holy laws and instructions. He talks about the priest outfits and the menorah and the bread and these different compartments where it's the holy space and then it's the Holy of Holies. And inside of the Holy of Holies is where the presence of God himself is going to dwell. And that's on the Ark of the Covenant. And some of you guys have seen the Ark before. Have y'all seen that? And if you're old like me, you know what happens if you touch the Ark or you let Nazis get it? You get your face melted, right? Okay. You got to be like 40 plus to even know what that movie is. Okay, so this is the Ark of the Covenant. This is where the presence of God himself would dwell. Okay, and they would put it in this back room. And God gave Moses specific instructions on how to build this tent down to the thread. Like use this color, use this type of thread. And so Moses is up there on top of this mountain writing all this down. Okay, well, while he's up there, the people down at the bottom, there's a trend with the Israelites. They complain a lot. They're kind of like, we're hungry and we're tired and we don't have any water. Why don't you just let us go back to Egypt? At least they fed us there. Now we're out here in the middle of nowhere. And so God's like, man, these people, bro. I thought I could like do something new without flooding the earth, but maybe I should. And Moses is like, hold on. Don't forget the covenant that you made with Abraham. And it's strange that he has to remind God of his covenant, but God decides to stay true to it, even though it's going to cost him. And that just shows you some of like God's character, right? And it's when you read stuff like this, you just kind of learn about how God functions with different people and the way he responds. Okay, so let me fast forward a little bit. The boys get direct instructions about the temple, okay, about how it's exactly supposed to set up, what the priest should wear. They put on these very specific things called ephods, and there's a gem to represent every single tribe. And these are all the sons of Jacob. Remember, Jacob the father, Israel, has 12 sons, and they set up all these tribes, and they each get their own stone, and the priests wear this around their chest. It's called an ephod. And this is like a holy garment, and they would go and worship in the Holy of Holies. This is the menorah. They have what's called a Day of Atonement, which is once a year. They sacrifice 2 goats. And this is to kind of like cover the sins of all of Israel all at the exact same time. And if you have any Jewish friends, they celebrate, it's called Yom Kippur. You guys ever heard of that? They do it every single year. And it's supposed to atone for all of the sins of Israel, even for the people that don't participate in some of the sacrifices. Okay, so Leviticus. And I'm already like almost out of time, so I'm going to go quick. Leviticus is where we're at now. And so they build the temple, okay? Moses' instruction. This is Moses here telling them how to do it. He tells them to put the ark in the back, just like God said exactly. And they have this big opening ceremony. And this is how Exodus ends. The temple opens, and it's officially, and the presence of God himself fills the tent, is what it says. It's time to go in. Moses, the legend, starts to enter, but he can't. And the book ends. Some things are wrong. The relationship still needs work. And this is where the book of Leviticus starts. And it basically goes and explains like God's goodness is like the sun. It's good, but it's dangerous. He provides a solution for drawing into proximity of his holy presence. And this is where he comes up with like the rituals that they have to do. Like I said earlier, I don't know exactly why it's certain animals and why the sacrifice, but the sacrifice was symbolic for the covering of their sins, so they temporarily could enter into the presence of God and not fall over dead. In other words, if they went in impure into this tent, they would die, because you cannot have the goodness of God simultaneously existing with sin. Okay? It will destroy the sin. It's not like it's a battle. The sin immediately gets dissolved. So Leviticus is broken up into 7 sections. There's rituals, like I said, the priesthood, and then purity. But it's also like a lot of tribal guidelines, and I have a photo here that kind of gives you an idea of how they were given instructions on how to set their tribes up. And this is important. If I had more time, I'd go into this. But the very first thing they did when they would move is they'd set up a tent in the center. Why? Because the most important thing to them was the presence of God. And they built their homes around it. And so it had to be really important, because if it was me and I'm lugging all my tents and stuff through the sand, and the first thing you do before you even set up your own house is you go and you build the temple so that God can dwell there. And then from that, everybody builds outward. You see what I'm saying? So, I'm going to jump even faster. Day of Atonement. He gives them a lot of like cultural instructions here in the book of Leviticus. It's sort of like at this point, it says there are roughly 2 to 3 million people with them in the desert. So it's a lot of people. And so a lot of Leviticus is like instructions on how to run the tribe. And this is where you get some of the confusion sometimes in modern day stuff, where they try to leverage old scriptures and go like, well, it says anybody that does this should be put down. It's like those were Levitical instructions for the tribes at that time. They were trying to manage 2 to 3 million people. And you can only imagine things like sanitation at this scale. And so they give detailed instructions in Leviticus of like, hey, everybody, you have to bathe. Everybody has to bathe. You can't be in the tents. And if you stink, we're going to make you leave. Stop eating pigs raw. You have to cook your food. Stop eating raw food. Everyone's going to die of syphilis and dysentery and all these disgusting things. Like, there's so many of us, we've got to have cultural rules. And so a lot of Leviticus is moral rules, tribal rules, responsibility rules. It talks about property and what things you're allowed to trade and the way you should treat. It even talks about your servants and how you're supposed to treat them. Like I said, people will go back sometimes to this very specific moment in time and leverage some of these scriptures, and this is where they come from. They come from Leviticus. So Leviticus is really tribal rules and guidelines. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead so that way I can finish in time to Numbers. We're in Numbers now, the very next book. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. And God is like, all right, you guys have been at the foot of Mount Sinai for a year now. It's time to move. Because they start complaining. And I left out the part where Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments and he goes, do you guys see these? Are y'all good with it? And they're all like, yes, we agree. We will definitely be this holy nation God wants us to be. Moses goes back up, meets with God again, comes back down, and they're worshiping a golden calf. And Moses rage breaks the 10 Commandments. Because he's like, you got to be kidding me. You just committed to this and now you're already... Now, some time did go by. It was like a 40-day window right there. And it says the children of Israel got impatient. And they decided. So anyway, God remixed the 10 Commandments for Moses. And they keep moving. So God's like, all right, we need to change up. Let's move the tribe now. So Numbers in Hebrews actually means in the wilderness. And so they're going to be on the move now. And so the first thing they do is they take a census. They go like, all right, we got a lot more people now. You guys have been multiplying. Someone needs to count them. And this is where they think roughly when they were about to start moving for the first time from Mount Sinai, that there's roughly 2 to 3 million. And so God gives them even instructions on how to move. He says, take the Levitical priests and put them out front and have them hold the Ark of the Covenant. And the rest of the tribes will be in specific orders as they march. And this is how I want you guys to move. But most importantly, they would follow the cloud of God. So anytime God's presence would move, they would go, okay, it's time for us to move. They'd pack all their stuff up and they would follow the cloud. And so God was guiding them. So they do a little journey here. From Mount Sinai, who knows exactly their path, but they end up in the wilderness of Paran. And this is when Moses goes and sends spies ahead. And he goes, go check out this land of Canaan and let me know what you think. Remember, he sends 12 spies. And so 12 spies come back, and 10 of those spies are like, there's no way, bro. There's giants over there, and they will destroy us. We are like grasshoppers to them. But they do have a lot of food. That is true. It's very, very plentiful land. So they get the view, and they're like, the land is legit. We definitely want to move there, but there's huge people, and they'll destroy us. We're too weak. And 2 of them gave a good report. You guys, Caleb is one, and the other one was Joshua. Now, I could do a whole thing on Joshua, and I'll get to that next week. But Joshua was another one. So they continued to move all the way up to where the book ends. And I'm going to switch gears in just a second. But this is where they end up, right across the Jordan River from Jericho. And this is sort of an interesting story. Let's see. They marched through the kingdom of Moab. And this is in the book of Numbers here. And basically what happens, I'm going to have to tell you the summarized for time, but the king sees these people marching through, and he's like, bro, that is a lot of people. And he's scared, and he says, do you see, I kind of have sort of an interpretation. He's like, that is like a sea of people. They're literally going to drink up all the water in the entire kingdom and eat all of our food. So he's fearful. And not to mention the Israelites, this part's not talked about a whole lot, but they did have a military with them. And I'll talk about this more next week, but Joshua led that military. So Joshua was basically Moses' guard, okay? And I'll talk more about that next week, but he was outside. Y'all hear those stories of Moses meeting face-to-face with God in a tent? Joshua was at the door. So, let me jump ahead back here. So they're looking at this massive tribe, and they've also heard legend of the Israelites defeating enemies on their way to them. So the king is fearful. And he does something strange. He goes, go get me Balaam. And Balaam is like a well-known sorcerer at that time. Remember earlier I said, the Bible has other gods in it that do stuff. It's kind of strange, but it's in there. So this dude is known as basically a sorcerer for hire. And he's known for putting curses and blessings on people, and it works. And this guy, strangely enough, is in the Hebrew Bible, but he's documented in the Assyrian culture and the Babylonian culture. So this guy definitely existed, and he's exactly what the scriptures say he was. He was considered like a medium, or what we would call a modern day whatever. A witch, whatever you want to call it, warlock. Anyway, the king goes, hey, go get Balaam and tell him I'll pay him a bunch of money to come and curse these Israeli people, these Hebrews, and get them out of my land. And so Balaam actually says, I'll communicate with Yahweh. I communicate with all the gods, but I can only do what he says. So if Yahweh says he doesn't want to curse those people, I can't do it. I don't know what to tell you. And a lot of scholars say he was trying to drive the price up with the king and bargain a little bit. So the guys come back to Balaam, and they're like, okay, the king's up the ante if you'll come and curse them. So Balaam shows up, and from the mountaintop up here, begins to set up all these altars to rain curses of sorcery down on the nation of Israel. And instead of curses, every word out of his mouth is a prophetic blessing. And so God does this 3 times in a row, and the king is like, what are you doing? Stop talking. Just stop talking. You're making this worse. I'd rather you not even talk than bless them one more time. Just stop. And Balaam tells him, he's like, I told you, I'm only going to say what Yahweh's telling me to say. And this is what he's telling me. He's telling me that these people are blessed, and he's called them, and he's given them this land. I'm just telling him what he's telling me. So that's strange. I'm not going to lie. It's strange that God is actually speaking through a well-known sorcerer to a king, and these people don't even serve or honor God. But it's just testament to God works in mysterious ways, and you never really know. And there's a lot of mystery in how this pans out. But as the Israelites are down in this basin complaining about this march, and when are we going to get there, God is up on the hills protecting them. So, we come to our last book, and I'm going to wrap up right here. And this is the book of Deuteronomy. And what is happening now is we have made it all the way to our destination. Okay? And there was a long period of time here, and I'm leaving out some details, but I'm trying to get the gist of what happens to you guys. So, they're here now. They're on the other side of the Jordan River, facing Jericho. And Moses gives a final speech. Moses is 120 years old now. He's led Israel very strongly and honored the Lord with everything he has done. And he gives them a final speech. So Deuteronomy actually means second law. So this is like Moses basically giving his rendition and reconfirming the law. And so he comes up and speaks to all of them at one time. I don't know how he did that. They didn't have microphones. Maybe they had people repeating the message. I don't know. You're trying to talk to 3 million people at one time. It would be tough. But anyway, he goes on and he reiterates the law. And he says, he gives a speech to the new generation. And I left this part out, but the previous generation chose to stay lost. You know, you always hear, like, how on earth could they wander the desert for 40 years? They chose actively to eat out of the other tree. And because they chose to eat out of the tree of autonomy, the tree out of I know best, and God doesn't know what he's doing, God honors it. And he goes, that's fine. If you guys want to eat of that tree, I honor free will. And if you want to, and so what's going to happen is your whole entire generation is going to die out here in this desert. Y'all, if y'all drive that march that they went on in a car, it's only a 9-hour drive. How on earth did they get lost for 40 years? Because they were lost here. And they chose to be lost. And so he says, okay, well, your generation is going to die out here in the desert, and the next generation will go in. And so Moses now is speaking to that next generation. The old generation's passed away. Moses is on the tail end of it, and he's giving a charge to this next group of kids coming up. And he says, don't make the same mistakes your parents did. Trust that God is going to provide for you, and don't worry. Don't take the path of autonomy. It leads in destruction. And it will destroy your life just like it destroyed theirs. And you will die and perish out in the desert, lost and alone, just like they did. And you will never receive the promises that God has for your life. So choose this day and honor God. Choose life is what he tells them. He says, choose life. If you can hear anything from me on my last words, honor the Torah. Honor what was written in the 10 Commandments. Serve the Lord God in your life. Keep him first. No other gods before him. Keep him as the number one thing in your life, and he will provide, and everything will be okay. And you guys will inherit the promised land that was promised. So, through you and your family, all of the nations are going to find God's blessing. And if they do this, they will become the family of Abraham that God established all those years ago. Now, Moses repeats and expands on the law. He warns them of the consequences versus rebellion, blessings versus curses. And he says, I set before you today life or death, blessing or curse. Which tree? He says, choose life. He seems to have low confidence in them, probably from his years on the road. So he predicts their failure. He says, if you choose death, this is what's going to happen. And he almost prophetically talks about the exile. And I'll get to that next week when I talk about history and the exile of the Jews. But Moses basically prophetically talks about it right here. Anyway, he predicts that on the other side of exile, though, God's going to transform their hearts. He appoints Joshua as his new leader, and that's where we're going to pick up next week. And Moses then puts the 10 Commandments in the Ark of the Covenant. He hikes up the mountain where he can see the promised land, and he dies. So at 120 years old, Moses is put to rest. This is where people think he died. Nobody really knows. But you can see all these different locations. In other words, Moses got like one final scenic view before he passed away. So I want to read this in closing, and then I'll wrap up. Deuteronomy 34:7. Moses was 120 years old when he died, but his eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid hands on him, so the children of Israel heeded him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. But, that being said, Joshua's awesome, but since Moses, there has not risen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. So Moses was very unique. So next week we will study the history books. So if you guys can remember to bring back your sheet with you, we'll go over the next section. And we're going to find out what this massive nation of set-apart people does with Moses' final charge with their new leader Joshua at the helm. And it's going to be fun. So thank you guys for bearing this along. Let me pray and we'll dismiss. God, thank you again for a chance to come and learn about you, Father. The more we get to know you, God, the more we'll be able to know when you're speaking to us. And the more we'll be able to identify when you're trying to intervene in our life, God, and give us burning bush moments or trying to use what somebody meant for evil, you're actually going to spin it, God, and use it for good. Give us eyes to be able to see that as we learn more about your character and the way that you care for people and the great lengths that you're willing to go to be able to have connection with us and communion with us, just like you did in the garden, God. So thank you for that. Be with everybody this week as they go out and live for you, God. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, guys. See you next week.